accepted that Christ wasn't born on the 25th of December, so why are you keeping this pagan festival? So I said, do you accept that Jesus was a king? It was announced that he was heir to David's throne, and we accepted he's a king. Yes, she said he's a king. I said, well, kings have got a real birthday, and they've got an official birthday.
Yeah,
like
very good.
Yeah,
That's a really good answer.
I said the 25th of December is his official birthday, and that's why I...
Absolutely. Well done.
What an excellent. I really like that one, yeah. Unfortunately, I've never had a Jehovah's Witness come on Christmas Day, but they obviously picked on you deliberately.
I noticed your stars, Kristen, because I've been just printing off a text that we can put on gifts with for River Life for the ladies, and I did the text, put on a star, and then tried to just duplicate it.
Yeah.
But only I had to give up.
So what?
It would duplicate the text. I could not keep the star in the right place with the right size. Apple computer could not do it, so I gave up.
Oh well, I don't know how you do it on the
done.
Apple, but yeah.
Well done.
Okay. Right. Well, should we get back together? Just a quick, because I just to remind folks, I think is there an offering basket? And yeah. So, yes. Some folks in the room are very kindly are partners of mine, so they support me a small amount of money each month, kind of around £5. I have quite a few of these folks, which actually enables me to write the books I do. So thank you very much if you are one of those. But otherwise, part of the thing, obviously, just a flag is I live by ministry, so it really helps if any kind of offerings or gifts that folks want to put in, and also the hire of the room and all those other things it kind of covers. So I'll just mention that now before we get going. Right. Actually, those of you that are partners, have you seen the thing in February? Those of you that had the, did you see it? Yeah. So okay. I sent an email. I think it was this morning. It went out this morning. Yeah. So actually, the next book comes out in February. So we're doing a kind of a launch event, which is free up in London at the Emmanuel Centre. Which hopefully will be nice and fun. And the nice news, some of you will understand it, but I've now got Graham Kendrick writing the foreword for it, or giving me a quote. He's giving me a quote for the cover, which I thought would be nice, having a book on Psalms with a well-known worship leader on the thing. So that's well, Graham Kendrick. Yeah, I say he's doing it. I wrote and said, "Would you do that?" He said, "Oh, I'm really interested if you've done one on Psalms. Please send it." He might not like it, but you know, but it'll be embarrassing for him to say no now, won't it? So I can kind of say that. Right. So let's. I've started recording. Oh, I've just made comments about. Okay. All right. So we're now officially going. Okay.
This is going commercial.
Right. Okay. So no, hang on. What have I just done? There we go. So we come to this thing about the various activities of the stars in 6 and 7, 6 and 5 BC. It's interesting that for a long time it seems that people knew that there was a conjunction of the planets in 6 BC. So this is actually 1465. But it's kind of a letter, and in the letter, so this Prince Frederick de Urbino, who knows where that is, asks a guy called Regiomontanus, who's an astronomer. They're both astronomers. Actually, Regiomontanus becomes a future bishop. And he writes to him and says, "Given that the appearance of Christ is regarded as a consequence of the grand conjunction of the three superior planets, find the year of his birth." So what we know from that is that at that period there was an understanding, which is 1,500 years, 1,500 years, a long time after. But it's interesting how much information we've lost in the last 500 years that was maintained for long periods of time. So at that time, it seems that people are talking about in the year that Jesus was born that the three planets coincided. And so Regiomontanus goes to try and work it out and decides it's too complicated. The maths is too complicated. So it couldn't be done. He can't find the year, but that's how they were going to try and do it. We can, though. He couldn't answer the question. We can. So I said, it seems, though, that they have access to ancient Greek or Latin or Persian books, which seem to have been lost, and they seem to know about a tradition of the massing of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter that precedes Jesus' birth. So we know that actually now happens in 6 BC. It happens in February. But just interesting. So we've known for 500 years that that's what they used to think. We don't know where it comes from, but we know they used to, and we can actually put it into 6 BC. But what about that horoscope that I mentioned? Because remember I said there was 2 planets conjoined in 7 BC, and we've known about that for over 1,000 years. 3 planets that were conjoined. We know that people have been looking for it in the year that Jesus is born, but we've now been able to work that out. We know it's at the beginning of 6 BC. But there's the divine horoscope that happens in 6 BC. So I've got these are proper astrologers from around the period. So here you go, Vettius Valens, 120 to 175 AD. He writes and says that the Jupiter is the ruler or the crowns of offices. It's the star that heralds the arrival of the kings in their horoscopes. So very simple, straightforward, probably would have guessed it anyway. If we're looking for a planet that rises before the sun on a particular morning to herald the birth of a king, we're going to be looking for Jupiter. So tied it down quite quickly because Jupiter is the crowns of office. So if Matthew's referring to a helically rising star in 2:9, that's Matthew chapter 2 verse 9. So it would have to be Jupiter. So this happens, but that happens a couple of times a year. So that's not, that in itself is not enough. That makes sense because that will happen a couple of times. Now here's the part of the story of the regal horoscope. Astrologers using the older Babylonian method of astrological readings do observe a spectacular run of events. Now the reason I put it this way is because way back in the medieval period, people had looked at this and tried to solve Matthew's problems astrologically, but they used Greek astrology rather than Babylonian. Does that make sense? Which actually doesn't catch on until much later. So although the Greek Empire has come and been, astrologers, the Magi themselves, even if they're living in Greece, are still using the older system. And that was part of the reason why it was never solved. But you will sometimes hear about stories about astrology to do with Jesus' birth, that say Jupiter was in Virgo when he is born and things like that, and Virgo being Mary and so on. But all of that comes from medieval period and is using stuff from the wrong period. So using this older Babylonian things, there is actually a spectacular horoscope. When I use the word spectacular, it is one that will only happen once in your lifetime if you're lucky. Okay. And it happens in 6 BC. So Jupiter, the regal planet, appears on this day, and it's actually April the 17th. Now notice how close that is to that little period that we said the early church seems that period from the 20th to the 20th of April to the 20th of May. That was the kind of period that seems the earliest memory of Jesus' birth is. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And with this spectacular horoscope actually happens on April the 17th, just 3 days before. And given that the Magi aren't there until some months later, it's very easy to see how the two could act. One could herald the birth of Jesus. Does that make sense in this kind of period? So on the morning of April the 17th, Jupiter, it's the regal planet, it rises as a morning star, which is a helical rising, and it rises in Aries, which actually is the symbol of Judea. So you see those coins? Can you see they've got Aries, they've got the goat, and there's a star in it. And that's actually to do with a later event, an astronomical event that happens about 8 AD. So I think it's a bit later, but it's illustrating why these events were actually marked in the ancient world. And here we have a picture of a star in Aries. And so I'm just going to kind of show you, here's another astrologer, Claudius Ptolemy, 100 to 175 AD. He lists the countries that are assigned to Aries. Okay, so in his writing, we can see in the ancient world which countries they assumed belong to Aries. So they are Quayle, Syria, Palestine, Idumea, Judea, and all of those parts that were parts of Herod's kingdom. So all of Herod's kingdom comes under the sign of Aries. Okay, and on April the 17th, Jupiter rises as a morning star in the constellation of Aries, which is assigned to the region of the kingdoms that belong to Herod. Okay, and you notice what I'm doing is not giving you kind of modern theories. I'm trying to show you this is from contemporary writing. This is from the same century as Jesus is in. And there's also a poem about astrology that's composed 10 to 15 AD, so even closer now. And it assigns the entire Near East to Aries, which is less precise, but it is a poem. So, but in its kind of poetic form, it just kind of assigns all of the Middle East to who's that? Suetonius, is it? Hang on, I can't see. Yeah, Suetonius, the historian, who's now 69 to 122, again very close to Jesus, and records that astrologers indicated that Nero would lose and regain power in the East, in Jerusalem, based on Aries' position at his birth. So here we have Nero and astrologers looking at the day he was born, because of what was going on in Aries, predict that he will lose Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is seen as being connected with Aries, which is in its position at his birth. So on. Do you see how these are real Magi talking about Jerusalem because of something happening in Aries. We have a real solid history about it, even to the degree that Nero's horoscope involves references to that. Now, on the morning of the 17th, just after Jupiter rises, Saturn follows Jupiter as still before the sun has risen, so still as a helical rising. So now we have Jupiter in the sky, and we have Saturn following it. So that's actually, can you see the image there? We've got two morning stars in that one. You can probably just about see it from the back. Two little dots in the sky. That's what's going on there. In the old Babylonian astrology, there's a thing about attendant planets. So Jupiter is the lead, it rises first, but there's something about attendant planets, others that come up with it. They're specific planets which guard the sun and the moon from negative aspects in the total horoscope. So the position of extra stars in the horoscope can actually kind of make a good luck horoscope, cuts out the bad luck, if I can put it that way. Do apologise for talking this way. I'm hopefully not offending anyone but this is we're treating it as history, not as something that we necessarily believe today. I say necessarily, I don't believe it today, just in case you're worrying. So we don't believe it's true, but it is historical. So this is it affects the minds of the historic thinkers. So if Jupiter or Saturn precede the sun, then they are considered to be attendant. So both of them have preceded the sun. They are both attendant, which means that they're cutting out any bad aspects. So anything that you might think was a bad thing in this horoscope is now being scrubbed off the horoscope because they've risen before the sun has risen. Does that make sense? And Venus and Mars are attendant if they follow the moon. Okay, so just that's the next one. Mercury can be attendant for both the sun or the moon. So these are the planets as they are. What then happens is before the sun rises, the moon comes up as well. So we're really getting a lot going on in the sky. The moon also rises just before the sun. So here we have two helical stars and we've got the moon. See, I actually found pictures of these on the internet. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? I put two helical stars and the moon and it comes up with a picture. Obviously this isn't the sky at night in Jesus' birth year, but so they didn't have digital cameras back then. So.
Really?
So that going back to that Vettius Valens, he describes the conditions for regal births. So here they are. At the hour of the birth, the moon must be ascendant with Saturn. Okay, this always happens as a celestial body breaks the horizon. I put that here. If Jupiter is also present, they will be a very great king. So this is again something that happens on the 17th, and we have here historic records of people saying what it means is the moon is in the sky and it's attendant, and also Saturn is attendant, and Jupiter's there. This guy is really important. Okay, so all of this has happened on the 17th of April, 6 BC. And then the sun rises, and it's also in Aries, the constellation that gives it what's called an exalted position. So all of these things are happening in Aries, and they're all kind of clustered, so they're all very significant for just one particular land block, which basically means something big is happening in Judea. Okay. So Vettius Valens then tells us in his anthology that the key regal conjunctions are the sun Jupiter, the moon Jupiter, or the sun and the moon, and actually all of them are together in the same space. So he's basically saying it's a really good sign for a king if you've got any of these partnerships going on, and actually on April the 17th all of them are happening. Okay, so So there's all three regal conjunctions are happening at the same time. So then Mars and Venus follow the Sun and the Moon. And if you remember going back, that means they're attendant because they followed the Moon. They didn't come before the Sun, they followed the Moon, which means they are now playing the role of good luck charms as well. Okay, so same thing is happening. And they come up not this time in Aries, but they come up in related parts of the sky, which in the horoscope system is called the trine. So things are grouped together into three related signs, and they're part of the same trine. So briefly, all four planets and the Sun and the Moon are visible in the order in which they arose, and all four planets are playing an attendant role. So they are all in significant positions. Not one of them is in a bad position. Everything is kind of building up, building together. Finally, what happens is the Moon occludes, which means passes in front of Jupiter. And Vettius Valens tells us that the Moon is, when the Moon is in good aspect, i.e. when it's in conjunction, or in trine, so here it's about conjunction with Jupiter, it produces notable leaders who are, now spot that phrase, worthy of gifts and honours. So this is the astrological system. On the 17th of April, 6 BC, because we can wind back the stars with modern computer technology, we actually know that all of these conditions are matched, including the final one, which is the Moon passes in front of Jupiter. In fact, even if they just come close, according to a contemporary astrologer, it means that the leader is worthy of gifts and honours. And we know that the Magi did used to turn up with gifts and honours, and here is something going on that says, so it is almost inconceivable that no Magi across the entire of the ancient world, because the Magi were spread over the whole of the Greek Empire, the Greeks spread them all over, the idea that no Magi would have spotted this and not tried to respond to it is almost beyond kind of credulity. Does that make sense? In other words, even if the story wasn't here in the New Testament, if it wasn't there and it wasn't therefore contentious, historians were going, well, we ought to look for evidence of them turning up, because it would be almost impossible that they wouldn't. Does that make sense? So it's because of this very, very kind of strong position of the things, honouring the new king. I've got a kind of final little list. There's another guy, Firmicus Maternus Julius. He lists the conditions. He's writing a bit later, but he's kind of compiled a work on the ancient, 346, but he's writing on the older system. He compiles a list, which a bit like we've gone through, of conditions for really important regal births. And some of them, he points out, are fulfilled by Caesar Augustus. So he points out that some of these great conditions but almost all of them are fulfilled on the April the 17th date. So the conditions are, the Moon is moving towards Jupiter. The closer it gets, the better. Tick to that one, because that's what happens. Jupiter is in its trine, i.e. the set of three related star signs. Yes, it is. The Sun is exalted in the constellation that increases its impact. Yep, that's the truth. Jupiter is attended by the Sun or Saturn. I put 2 ticks there because it's attended by both. And the morning rising increases the significance, which is what they saw. It was a morning rising. It wasn't just something that happened during the day. So now, because of ancient astrology or astronomy, they would have known roughly that something like this was about to happen, because they could make certain amounts of predictions. But you had to observe to know for sure. See, but your charts and so on and experience would tell you what it looks like. We're moving to a point where it looks like something's going to come together in Aries. So you can imagine they won't do anything until they've actually observed it. But actually, it's not something that they just happened to sleep in that morning and missed it, because they would have known something was going on and probably start to raise interest to make sure they were there to observe. So the Sun, Jupiter and Saturn are all in Aries. These are the three rulers of the trine, which is made up of Aries, Leo and Sagittarius. All these conditions hold what's called the ascendant and mid-heaven positions, i.e. 2 times during the day, these things happen. So it happens twice during the day, not just once. So in the minds of the Magi, something major has happened in the kingdom, the landmass ruled over by Herod. It's got divine elements, it's got kingly elements, it's kind of totally unprecedented in their lifetime. It's much better than the horoscope that Caesar Augustus has had. So they want to go and do something about it. So it's a once-in-a-lifetime horoscope. The meaning of the celestial events are unequivocal. So a divine king is being born in Judea, and he's going to have a global reign. There's a lot more in this, because the book I originally tracked down, has a lot more of the stuff that I've kind of summarised out. And this is what's driven the kind of the theological conferences, people looking at it saying, actually, it does stack up. This isn't just hearsay. This really is what the history says. So the earlier set, and it's interesting because the earlier set of dates assigned to Jesus by Clement of Alexandria, May 20th or April 20th or 21st, are only a few days after that. And as we're going to see, the Magi don't turn up for quite a while. So you can have two totally separate sources. They're not trying to fake it, but are arriving within a few days of each other. Does that make sense? And we mustn't forget the comet theory, because I did say we'd look at all of these things. Because in 5 BC, we know from Chinese astronomers that at some point between the 9th of March and the 6th of April in 5 BC, a tailed comet appears for 70 days, a period of 70 days. It travels westward and would seem to stand vertically towards the end of its visibility in May or June time. So it would stand over. So you remember saying, so it goes retrograde, so it's going westward, in other words, against the flow. So it's going before them. So we've got a similar thing. It rises at some point. It goes before, but it's in 5 BC. So let's look at the text and let's try and fit all the bits together. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem of Judea in the time of Herod, and wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. So the time details in Matthew allow Jesus. Okay. Now here's an important point, because those who were here last week. And people will follow the events with the Magi. I think it's not, you don't have to do it this way, but it makes most sense, as we'll see, that Jesus' parents have actually returned to Nazareth at this point that the Magi turn up. Jesus has been born in Bethlehem. The Magi are going to go and look for him in Bethlehem, but we're going to see it takes them quite a while to find Jesus. It takes them at least one night, let's put it that way, very minimal one night, and Bethlehem is only 2 hours away from Herod's palace. So in other words, it's more that they don't go to Bethlehem and find Jesus instantly, is what I'm driving at. And one night is the absolute minimum. It looks a bit longer than that, as we'll see. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem. According to Luke, he's after 40 days when Mary's gone to the temple and he's been prophesied over. It says they returned to Galilee. So they go back at this stage. But in the meantime, let's assume that the sign has been observed on April the 17th. And then what probably happens is word goes out, because they're spread all over the place. So so-and-so sends a message to a friend a few hundred miles away down the Fertile Crescent. Did you see the event? Did you see it? What did you see? What was your observation? Let's meet together. We need to talk about this. It was quite a significant thing. So a whole amount of conversation starts to kind of kick off amongst senior Magi, and they probably want to get together and discuss these things. So they're a quasi-religious class. They live mainly in Persia, Mesopotamia and Arabia, which is now Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. They're known to have visited kings in other countries, so we know from Suetonius that Tiridates, the king of Armenia, leads a procession of Magi to pay homage to Nero in Rome in 66 AD. They're skilled in interpreting the stars. So the word has gone out in April. Actually, we get to August the 23rd, and suddenly Jupiter starts to move in a retrograde motion across the sky, what the ancients call going before. Okay, so in other words, heading westwards. So on August the 23rd, so it happened on April the 17th, but on August the 23rd, it starts going westwards. And on August the 30th, Jupiter starts, it stations. On August the 23rd, it stations, it becomes stationary. And then it starts actually going westward on August the 30th. So the Magi are now making plans to visit Judea, because they figure something's happened. And it's kind of interesting because now the star is moving west, and that's the direction they have to go in to get to Jerusalem. Does that make sense? So it all seems rather significant. And on October the 27th, Jupiter re-enters Aries, which seems like a good time to get going if you're a Magi. So you can imagine they've been debating it for a bit. They suddenly notice it's gone stationary. It's now going west. Someone says it's heading west. Maybe we should go west. And by October the 27th, it's now been heading westward. It's been going backwards. You see, it's been travelling eastwards. So it's left Aries some months ago, but it's turned around. It's heading back. In October time, they start heading. So perhaps that's the time the Magi actually get up and get going. If I can just kind of putting these bits together. November the 19th, the Magi are still en route to Jerusalem. Actually, it's taking them a bit of time, so I've got to work because it's longer than it needs to. But you understand, I'm not really saying this is exactly the date. I'm just kind of giving you a flow, because we're going to see the key one is at the end, which locks us in. November the 19th, as the Magi are en route to Jerusalem, the Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter all come back into what they call trine aspect. Which is a kind of another mini regal portent, and that lasts into December. So in my thinking, I have the Magi arriving in Jerusalem around December time, and they come along and they're saying, so we're looking for the one who's born King of the Jews, and they go to see Herod because Herod has had loads of kids. It's very likely that it's one of Herod's, you know. So kind of, I'm laughing, but you know, he's had several. As I said, I think 10 wives, 3 at least of which we don't know their names even, but he has kids by lots of folks. So it's not unreasonable for them to kind of make their way towards trying to find Herod, to find out if he's had a new baby boy. And when Herod heard this, he was alarmed, and all Jerusalem with him, because he knows it's not one of his. And as we've seen already, he's beginning to kind of get this sort of paranoia about who's going to replace him. His sons have started to debate it. It already resulted in 2 of them being executed as part of this kind of internecine kind of feuding that's going on, in terms of who's going to replace him. Of course, 6 BC. Sorry, it says 6 AD. It should say 6 BC. In 6 BC, remember the census has been going on. They've been collecting the data for that, or they're starting to collect it. At this stage, the Pharisees are refusing to sign, and they're actually expressing the reason they're not going to sign. One of the reasons is because Herod's name's on the thing, and they're not going to pledge allegiance to him, and certainly not to the emperor. But at the moment, Herod doesn't know it because it's all still bubbling. Well, no, actually, sorry, he's probably just about finding it out, because by the time they arrive, the census has happened. Sorry, yes, it has actually happened. So he's probably finding out around this time that the Pharisees haven't kind of played ball. So he's very insecure. Oh, and okay, I've got my little comment there. So I've just contradicted myself. What I'm going to say is he's probably fined the Pharisees, and the Pharisees have had their fine paid for them. And at this stage, the rumour is going around about how one of his brother's children is going to replace him. Do you remember how we looked at that a couple of weeks ago? That was the same sort of timing. It's about this period when the Magi are turning up that he is picking up the rumours of this prophecy going around from the Pharisees that one of his brother's children is going to replace him as a dynasty. And would you just believe it? Some Magi turn up saying, we've heard someone's been born. See? So after assembling the chief priest and the expert in the law, he asked, from where is the Christ to be born? In Bethlehem of Judea, they said, because it's written, you Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and so on. So he tells them that. Then Herod privately summoned the wise men, determined from when the star had appeared. So it hasn't just happened. And notice, if it had been a really bright star, or even the comet, which hasn't happened yet, people in Jerusalem will be aware of it, but they don't practice astrology in Jerusalem, and it's just actually for most people we miss it, don't we? We just if you're not looking for it, you don't see it. This is something that's only been seen by those who are watching the skies every night. So they tell him. So he thinks, okay, so it's around April time. So April this last year. And they said, when we find him, inform me so I can go and worship him as well. Well, we know what's on his mind. There's reason why it's on his mind, because it's a current issue. So now I put that Bethlehem's only 2 hours maximum from Jerusalem, absolute max from Jerusalem. So it doesn't take them days. But if you read the record, it takes them a couple of days at least to find Jesus. And that is probably because, as I said, I think Jesus has left Bethlehem at this stage. which is what we read in Luke's Gospel, that after the time in the temple, they've gone back to. So, but you can imagine they would go down to Bethlehem, and they get to Bethlehem. But fortunately, of course, everybody in Bethlehem knows the story, because those old shepherds that we met went round telling everybody who would listen to them, and everybody was amazed by it. So there are plenty in Bethlehem who remember, and so they come asking the question, we're looking for a kid that was born in April, you know. Well, they don't call it April. Well, they might have done, I suppose, if they're using the Roman calendar. But because they've got to match it to the Jewish calendar, and actually, well, do you remember exactly what day? I don't remember exactly what day, but it was about then. You know, so that kind of talking going on. Well, no, that's the right series. Well, we think of it as Nisan the whatever or whatever, and so they kind of try and match the two. And someone says, well, I think they came from Nazareth. They went back up north. So perhaps they have to be redirected. And what we read in Matthew is, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them. So it's still in that retrograde motion, and stood over where the child was. So standing over means it's come to the end of its retrograde period, and that actually, if they diverted north to Galilee, it's going to take them 1 or 2 days by camel. And on December the 19th, Jupiter stations. So, stations in the sky just as the Magi are arriving where Jesus is now living, which is possibly Nazareth. See? Which now explains how it is they're able to sneak away, because Jerusalem really is the edge of Bethlehem really is the edge of Jerusalem. Very difficult for Eastern dignitaries with camels and everything else to leave the region without Herod knowing about it. But if actually they've gone on up into the north country, which is still part of Herod's kingdom, it's dead easy to head back home without him noticing. So just one of those little kind of tie-in. It's much easier for them to disappear without Herod realizing it because Herod has, we know, Herod has an established network of spies in every town who are constantly reporting anything to do with significance back to him, because he's paranoid about these things. So he would have no doubt tracked them to Bethlehem and seen them even leave the region, but the next thing he knows is they've never come back, but he doesn't know where from. So when they saw the star, they shouted joyfully, to Matthew, and they came into the house. So it implies that the stationing actually happens as they arrive, which is why we can put the stationing on the 19th of December, which is interesting because now we're hitting the period which actually somehow or other has become remembered as Christmas. Does that make sense? It gets even more interesting because actually the coming of the Magi is something that we'll see in a second.
Can I ask a goofy question?
Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, if the star is way up there, how would they know it was over the house?
So I think that all its meaning in this occasion is that it stops as they get to the place where Jesus is. So that it's kind of like, whoa, it stopped. So where are we? And it turns out to be that. So that
it wasn't that precise.
It's not shining.
So it's not shining the lights. It's not like. Yes. Because
getting the nativity.
No.
Scenes.
Well, I watched the original Ben-Hur the other day because we're getting into Christmas. Jude likes to watch Christmas films, and it does there. The light shines directly down on Bethlehem. So I think basically that's our imagining what. But what it says is it stood over where the child was. I think it means as they arrive at that period, they've been sent up that way. As they get there, they suddenly realise it stopped moving in that direction, the westward direction, and it's now stationary. It's going to be stationary for a couple of weeks. So the couple of weeks while they're there in Bethlehem, it never moves. You see, so I think that's what it.
I wonder that because angels are often designated and symbolise as stars.
Yeah.
Whether at that moment, for the final tuning of the house, an angel appeared.
He may well have. They were certainly there for the shepherds to direct them. Yeah. So there could be a bit of angelic. The thing I always put in with these things, it's a bit like because I'm about to start doing the Jesus in Exodus. Is I like things which mix the two, both the natural, physical history. So if you take the Exodus story, when in writing it, you can firmly root a whole lot of the miracles into natural phenomena. But you can't match, say, when Moses throws the staff down, it turns into a snake. That's not a natural phenomena. but actually that doesn't mean to say that therefore, that's, for instance, there's been a fascinating thing with the plagues are all the run of just 2 events. There are just 2 natural phenomena that produce all of the plagues, and then there's one's a cultural phenomena, 2 natural, one cultural phenomena. I think that's, and the fact that that's the case is one of those interesting things for skeptics. They have to say, well, it seems like it's a real report, because if the reasons that make the Nile go red would kill the fish, would drive out the frogs. If the frogs aren't there, then actually the frogs, when they rot, become breeding ground for flies and gnats. Do you see how I'm saying? So they have to say that's a genuine. We actually have observed that run of plagues in other places, because it is what happens. So they clearly recorded something that really happened. So, but we don't believe that anybody was there and the Exodus is real history. So how do we explain that they got that so accurate? I like that mix, but it still requires God to be active.
Yes, that's right.
If you see what I mean. So I think that's my natural place, if you like. I like that God works through natural phenomena all the time. So the natural phenomena don't take away the fact it's a miracle, but very often there's an element as well that just proves that he's in the mix. So it could well be what you're saying there, that finally the angel is there. They give gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. Very quick comment there. Interestingly, those things are only found together in the Bible at the time when the bride arrives in the Song of Solomon. So the bride arrives for his marriage, and theologically, as some of you will pick up, I believe that in good Jewish tradition, that a marriage isn't something that happens in a moment. It is something that's celebrated over a period of time. So I think that from the moment that Jesus comes, we are in the process, if you like, the beginning stages of the marriage of the Lamb, which is finally culminated, if that makes sense. So that the two kind of, I see those things. And actually here, it's just interesting, they give gifts, which we find to do with the arrival of the groom, which is effectively what's happening here with Jesus.
It's interesting that Matthew says, as they came into the house.
Yeah.
Whereas when the shepherds came, they came to the stable.
Yeah, so yeah, again, it's slightly different description. Yeah,
they've moved on.
They moved on at this stage. Yeah. So I put here December the 25th to 6 BC to the 5th of January 5 BC. The Magi perhaps stay through the Roman New Year, but then Jupiter starts moving on January the 5th, so it's been stationary, which is probably a good point for them to now leave. You stop and think about it. And interestingly, it means that they've pretty much been there during the period which actually both Eastern and Western churches celebrate as the coming of the Magi. Can you see that?
Yes.
So in actual fact, the coming of the Magi is roughly right, because we celebrate it we celebrate them coming on. Is it a week after Christmas in the Western Church, and on 2 weeks, which is about the 7th in the Eastern Church, I think is the timings. But they're warned in a dream not to return to Herod, so they go back by another route, which they can do because they're further north and Herod's down in the south. And so by the time they've gone, he hasn't really realised it. So they leave on January the 6th. The date which is remembered in Epiphany in the Orthodox date is the Orthodox date for Christmas. So it's just interesting to see how those dates are kind of coming together. After they're gone, an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph and says, "Get up, take your child and his mother and flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you, because Herod is going to look for the child to kill him." So he got up and took the child, his mother, during the night, and they went to Egypt and stayed there until Herod died. So it was in this way that was spoken out of the Lord, spoken out by the Lord through the prophet, was fulfilled. "I've called my son out of Egypt." So Origen and Eusebius state that Jesus and his family were in Egypt for 2 years, which implies that it's 6 BC. Because if Herod dies in 4 BC, can you see it again?
Yeah.
Can you see how much, interestingly, is kind of pushing us to the same period? So now, interestingly, of course, as we said, there's a comet in 5 BC. So here's Herod, who's kind of lost track of the Magi because he's having to deal with the problem of the Pharisees' prophecy and his brother's kids, and whether one of them is going to take over, and he's having people executed. And the next thing, would you believe it, there's a really big star that nobody can miss, which means that everybody's talking about this one because it's a comet. It's in 5 BC. It's now about a year since the date when the Magi said that they had that the star had first appeared. Do you remember he'd asked them? It's roughly a year later, and it prompts. I think therefore it's probably the comet that prompts Herod to remember the fact that they have been, and doesn't know where they've ended up. They doesn't know, but what he does do is he sends to where he'd sent them to, which is he sends soldiers down to Bethlehem to kill the children. So you know the as I say, it's now just over a year, I think, at this point, since the date that the Magi gave him for when the star appeared. So soldiers aren't going to be too accurate. It's basically a toddler, a child somewhere between 1 and 2. They could be toddling at this stage. So all children under 2, kill them. And historians say, well, how come we don't read about it in kind of more secular history? But Herod has killed so many people. Warlords and despots kill children. You know, it happens. It's happening. We're making a big thing at the moment of the persecution of the Rohingyas, but actually there have been child murders going on by warlords in Myanmar for decades, and it doesn't make the news. Just being really blunt, because that's what warlords do. They kill their neighbours' children to make sure they know what they're up to, and it's not a big story, if I can put it that way, for someone like Herod. So we don't have it recorded. It's just something that is remembered because those who live in the town certainly do remember it. And it could be something between 6 and 20 children, because it's not a big town. You see what I'm saying? I'm not trivializing it. I'm just saying that sometimes in our imagination it's thousands of children, and then that would be recorded in history. But it's not. It's a handful of children, and actually that is happening all the time in the ancient world, without comment. That what was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah. So this crime happens at the same moment that Herod is having leaders of the Pharisees arrested and killed. It's the same kind of timing. It's all going on at the same time. The death of a few peasant children is lost in the flow of history. Now we're going to look more seriously next week about the relationship and the time that Jesus is growing up in Egypt under Herod, and the flight from Herod and so on. So I won't spend too much time talking about it now, which I think is the last slide. It's the end. So next time we'll look at the issues of that little bit of history, which is only covered in a handful of verses, but it is a couple of years where we do know real secular history going on. And so that will be our final way before we finish for Christmas, and then I have to think of if we're going to do something next year. But also, particularly for even in your home group, you have to work out whether you want to come back to these things. So maybe I have to chat with you and find out good times so we don't dominate. But if you've enjoyed it, then it'd be good to do another one at some point. Good. So we're all done. Anyone like to ask any questions? No.
You probably
go on.
This next time then, because they were in Nazareth, but the angel warned them.
Yeah.
That they were still vulnerable.
Yeah. So I think, well, I mean, you never know how far. I guess it's one of those tricky things. It's the weight of the flow of things. It's the reference in Luke that they go back, which seems to be just after. He doesn't make any reference to fleeing to it. He just kind of seems to finish it. It's more complete if they've gone back. The fact that they're traveling during the night for at least 2 days, because they notice that the thing is still going ahead of them, and then it stations. Now that you don't need that length of time. You can walk. It's 2 hours walk, and they've got camels from Herod's palace to Bethlehem. So I think they must have moved from there. We don't know exactly where they've kind of got to, but I think it's that whole thing of maybe even the issue of who knows after that, if he puts out spies to pick up, who knows what he was looking for. We don't know of any other action, but he may have been looking. So.
When we read that the Magi worshipped him, do we understand that they recognise his deity, or was it like you worship the man? Yeah,
well, remember they're coming from a context which does deify people. So So I don't think it's a difficult thing to understand the idea of them seeing something divine in him. Yeah.
Wasn't that one of the signs?
Yes, it's one of the signs is about divinity. But as we said, we have Augustus, who has in Rome it's only just crept in, but in other empires it's been around for a while now. The idea of the emperor taking the divine title. Octavian, when he leads a debate that gets Julius Caesar recognised as a god, and then he takes the title and sticks it on coins and distributes all that as a propaganda thing, son of God. So he gets, because he's Julius Caesar's adopted son. Yeah. So he gets Julius Caesar recognised as a god. Then he mints a coin with his head on it that says son of God and spreads it across the whole of the empire. So it's just interesting. This is part of the background that Jesus comes into. Yeah. So the empire is kind of used to this idea that big military fantastic leaders like to claim divinity, but they're recognising it in the baby before he's done anything. So.
Like the leader of North Korea. He believes he's
a God, I didn't know that.
Yes,
so,
he does.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. So I went to school with some people that thought there was.
I'm not going to name names.
No, I better turn the video recording off now.